3 days ago, Governor Ron DeSantis signed into law a new bill which will authorize the death penalty for child rapists within the state of Florida. That's right, the new bill, which you can see up on your screen, is called HB 1297, and it overwhelmingly passed the Florida legislature just last month. In the Florida House, it passed 95-14, and in the Florida Senate, it passed 34-5. And after being signed by the governor, it's officially on the books. This new law will allow those individuals who have been found guilty of raping children under the age of 12 to be sentenced to execution. And I should mention that this death sentence does not actually require a unanimous jury decision, because what it will mean in practice is that starting now, in the state of Florida, a prosecutor will only need the approval of 8 out of 12 jurors to be able to go ahead with a sentence of capital punishment. Now, on Monday, while signing the bill into law, here's a short statement from Governor DeSantis.
The other thing we're doing is making clear that in Florida, we stand for the protection of children. And unfortunately, in our society, you have very heinous sex crimes that are committed against children under the age of 12 years old. And these are really the worst of the worst. And what happens is the perpetrators of these crimes are oftentimes serial offenders. And if someone does if they rape a child, and these are very young children, sometimes like 6, 7, 8 years old. If they do that once, chances are they will do it again unless they're stopped, unless they're incapacitated. And so we really believe that part of a just society is to have appropriate punishment. And so if you commit a crime that is really, really heinous, you should have the ultimate punishment. And so what this bill does is it challenges the U.S. Supreme Court for recently deciding, probably 6 or 7 years ago, they decided by 5-4, after over 200 years of our Constitution being in place, that somehow you could never have capital punishment for crimes like rape, even though some of these are some of the worst, even though you can have serial offenders who have violated multiple children under the age of 12. And so we think that that decision was wrong. We think that in the worst of the worst cases, the only appropriate punishment is the ultimate punishment. And so this bill sets up a procedure to be able to challenge that precedent and to be able to say that in Florida, we think that the worst of the worst crimes deserve the worst of the worst punishment. And I think that that's the only thing that's appropriate.
However, despite the overwhelming majority of the state legislature in Florida voting in favor of this bill, and despite it already having been signed into law, there's actually a big question of whether it's constitutional or not. That's because back in the year 2008, there was a landmark ruling over in the U.S. Supreme Court, which specifically outlawed capital punishment in the cases of child sexual battery cases. For your reference, in that particular 2008 case, there was a man named Patrick Kennedy who was found guilty of sexually abusing an 8-year-old girl. Now, at the time, this happened over in Louisiana. And at the time, there was a Louisiana state law which imposed the death penalty for the crime of raping a child. And as such, Mr. Kennedy was sentenced to death by the state. However, like a dying man grasping for any straw that he can grab, he appealed the decision all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled in the favor of the child rapist. Here's a short summary of the details of that particular appeal. Quote, Kennedy challenged his sentence as a violation of the 8th Amendment based on the rarity of a death sentence for this crime. No one in the U.S. has been executed for a crime other than murder since 1964. The court last considered a related issue in 1977 when it prohibited capital punishment for the rape of an adult in Coker versus Georgia. While that case did not specifically address the rape of children under the age of 12, the decision was viewed by some as limiting the death penalty to the crime of murder. Ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down as unconstitutional the Louisiana statute that allowed the death penalty for the rape of a child where the victim did not die. Then, in the majority opinion of the U.S. Supreme Court, here's what the justices wrote, quote, based on consensus and our own independent judgment, our holding is that a death sentence for one who raped but did not kill a child and who did not intend to assist another in killing the child is unconstitutional under the 8th and 14th Amendments. As it relates to crimes against individuals, though, The death penalty should not be expanded to instances where the victim's life was not taken. And so that's all to say that despite the fact that the law is now on the books over in Florida, very likely the first person to be given the death penalty for this particular crime in Florida will be appealing their case to the U.S. Supreme Court right away. And while based on the 2008 precedent, you would just assume that it would be an open and shut case, well, you never know. Occasionally, the U.S. Supreme Court does reverse their earlier rulings, such as in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, and more recently with Roe versus Wade. And so only time will tell what will happen to this particular law that Governor DeSantis just signed. However, looking at the situation from a bit of a higher vantage point, it's worth mentioning that there are currently two directions that states in America are moving in regarding this issue. On the one hand, you have states like Florida and Louisiana passing bills that go so far as to actually giving the death penalty for child sex crimes. But on the flip side, there's another effort, an effort to, you can say, alleviate some of the stigma that pedophiles experience by, for instance, removing anti-pedophile language from existing laws. As an example of what I mean by that, let's take the case of Minnesota. Right now, there is a transgender lawmaker who is actively working to take out language from the Minnesota Human Rights Act, which targets pedophiles. You see, back in the year 1973, the Minnesota legislature passed something known as the Human Rights Act, and since then has been periodically updated. Taken as a whole, the Minnesota Human Rights Act is essentially, you can think of it as the umbrella legislation which covers all sorts of discrimination that's based on things like race, color, religion, creed, national origin, gender, disability, as well as, I should note, sexual orientation. However, within the text of that law, they have a very specific caveat saying explicitly that pedophiles were not a protected sexual orientation. Specifically, in subsection 44, titled Sexual Orientation of the Human Rights Act, here's what it says, quote, "Sexual orientation means having or being perceived as having an emotional, physical, or sexual attachment to another person without regard to the sex of that person, or having been perceived as having an orientation for such attachment, or having or being perceived as having a self-image or identity not traditionally associated with one's biological maleness or femaleness. Sexual orientation does not include a physical or sexual attachment to children by an adult." And it's exactly that last sentence, the one which clarifies that pedophiles are not a protected class of people under this law, that has, you can say, ruffled some feathers. Specifically, this individual here is Lee Finke, a member of the Minnesota House of Representatives. He was born as a man, but now identifies as a woman. And just as a fun fact, he was actually named one of USA Today's Women of the Year in 2023. Regardless, just last week, the state representative introduced a new bill called the Take Pride Act. If you'd like to look it up, the filing number is HF 1655 on the Minnesota legislature website. And among the things that this bill would do would be to remove the anti-pedophile language within the Human Rights Act. It would remove the last sentence that we just read. Now, in terms of why exactly the state representative is trying to make this change, well, Fox News was able to get a hold of him, and here was his response. Quote, "Nothing in the bill changes or weakens any crimes against children or the state's ability to prosecute those who break the law. Of course, pedophilia is not a sexual orientation. The language never should have been included in the statutory definition in the first place. Crimes against children are located in Minnesota's criminal statutes, and again, they remain unchanged." Although the question becomes then, if nothing changes by removing that sentence, as he claims, why go through all the trouble of removing it in the first place? However, regardless of the logic of that answer, Republican lawmakers within the state of Minnesota, they were rather shocked when this proposed amendment was first introduced. Here's, for instance, what Lisa Demuth, who is a Republican House Minority Leader over in Minnesota, here's what she said regarding this proposed change. Quote, "Under the Human Rights Act, the definition of sexual orientation says that sexual orientation does not include physical or sexual attraction to children by an adult, or, more simply described, pedophilia. The Democrats' decision to strike this language is disturbing and inexplicable. House Republicans will be presenting an amendment today to clarify that pedophilia is absolutely not a protected class under the Human Rights Act. We sincerely hope that Democrats will join us in ensuring our children are protected." And so that is the situation in the lovely state of Minnesota. And I'd love to know your thoughts on this matter. Do you believe that this is just a case of that state congressman really just wanting to clean up the language of the human rights law? Maybe he thought that including pedophiles is disparaging to gay and trans people, and so by doing away with it, it preserves something like their dignity. Or, on the other side, do you think that there's perhaps more behind the scenes that remains unsaid, especially with the recent trend of intellectuals and college professors pushing the anti-stigmatization campaign of pedophiles by, for instance, referring to them as being MAPs, minor attracted people, and saying that it's a sexual orientation that some people cannot choose away from. I'd love to know your thoughts. Please leave them in the comment section below. I'll be reading them later tonight as well as into the week. And if you'd like to read any of the documents that we discussed in today's episode, such as the human rights law in Minnesota or the amendment that's being proposed to that human rights law, all those links will be down there in the description box below this video for you to peruse. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed, and most importantly, stay free.